Welcome to the Podkey summary of Discover New Capabilities in the App Intents Framework from WWDC 2026. A bunch of the newest app intents updates are really about one thing: making apps feel less clunky when they talk to the rest of the system. There's better sharing for structured data, better suggestions before you even ask, faster handling for big batches of content, and a clearer story for cross-device Siri, long-running tasks, and where an intent actually runs. And underneath all of that, Apple's also smoothing out the developer side with more native parameter types, and a cleaner way to handle one parameter that can represent multiple kinds of things. One of the nicer quality of life changes is value representation. The idea is simple. If your app has an entity that already contains structured data, you can expose that directly instead of packaging everything up as a file and hoping another app understands it. So if you've got something like a place descriptor with coordinates, another system app like Maps can just read the value for what it is. That cuts out the whole file-based handoff, which is one of those things that always sounds fine until you actually have to build around it. For developers, this isn't a giant rewrite either. You add a value representation alongside existing transferable conformants, and if the entity already has the right descriptor, you can often point to it with a key path and skip a lot of boilerplate. Then there's relevant entities, and this is really about timing. It lets an app proactively register entities with context, so the system can surface them when they make sense, even if the user hasn't searched for them or tapped on them yet. The example here is something like a new running playlist. Instead of waiting for a history of use, the app can tell the system, hey, this exists, and it's relevant in this kind of moment. That fills an important gap, because brand new content is usually invisible to systems that only learn from search or past behavior. The control here is pretty granular too. There's update entities, remove all entities, and removal tied to specific contexts, so apps can keep suggestions fresh instead of leaving stale stuff lying around. This also helps clarify a question developers keep running into. Which system should I use for discoverability? Spotlight indexing is for searchable content. It makes things findable, and Siri can retrieve that index content. Interaction donation is more about teaching Siri patterns based on what the user actually does over time. Relevant entities covers the third case, where something is new and contextually useful, but there's no search history or interaction history yet. So the short version is Spotlight for discoverability, donation for learner behavior, relevant entities for in-the-moment relevance. Those can overlap, but they're solving different parts of the same problem. Anti-collection is one of those changes that probably makes developers sigh with relief. Before this, if an intent took an array of entities, the system might resolve every full entity before the intent even started running. That gets expensive fast when you're doing something big, like tagging 1,000 photos. Anti-collection changes that by using an array of identifiers instead of an array of fully resolved entities. So the system doesn't have to eagerly load everything up front, and the performance difference can be huge. The benchmark example was a tagging shortcut that went from noticeable latency to almost instant after switching over, which is exactly the kind of improvement people actually feel. Another very practical addition is syncable entity. This is about giving an entity an identifier that stays stable across devices, so Siri can keep talking about the same thing, even when the conversation jumps from one device to another. If an app already has a server-assigned UUID or a CloudKit record ID, that can be the stable identifier the system uses. And if the app still relies on local IDs internally, it doesn't have to give that up. Developers can provide both a local ID and a stable ID through syncable entity identifier. That means app logic can keep using the local identifier on device while the system uses the stable one for cross-device resolution. It's a pretty clean answer to a surprisingly messy real-world problem. Some of the updates are less flashy but very welcome, especially the new native parameter types like duration and person name components. Instead of faking these with custom UI or awkward generic inputs, developers get built-in pickers, Siri understanding, and localization support. And because these types work consistently across Siri, shortcuts, and widgets, the intent definition gets simpler and the experience gets more uniform for users. That's one of those improvements that makes a platform feel more mature. Fewer special cases, fewer tiny workarounds. Related to that is the @UnionValue macro, which solves another common issue. Sometimes one intent parameter really needs to accept more than one kind of thing. With this macro, developers can generate a swift enum that wraps different entity types, like either a landmark collection or a photo album. That's especially handy for flexible widgets or shortcuts, where the user thinks in terms of a destination or a source, not in terms of your app's internal type hierarchy. The nice touch is that the macro also generates picker metadata, including display representations for the type and for each case. So in the Shortcuts UI, people actually see clear labels instead of a confusing generic bucket. There's also a meaningful step up for tasks that simply take a while. Long-running intent removes the old 30-second execution limit and runs the intent in a background task with progress automatically shown through live activities. That opens the door for things like large photo uploads, where the right experience is to let the task continue and keep the user informed instead of pretending everything should finish instantly. And paired with that is cancelable intent, which adds an on-cancel handler and passes along the cancellation reason. So if the user stops the task, the intent can actually clean up partial work or cancel network requests properly instead of just dropping everything on the floor. Very adult behavior from software, honestly. Execution targets is another one that sounds technical but fixes very concrete headaches. Normally, the system uses heuristics to decide whether an intent runs in the main app, an app intents extension, or a widget kit extension. Now, developers can override that and choose explicitly. That matters when different processes have different responsibilities. A widget might be fine for reading data, but writes may need to go through the main app to avoid data store conflicts. So this is less about control for control's sake, and more about making intent behavior predictable and safe. Taken together, these updates make app intents feel more capable in all the unglamorous but important ways. Faster, clearer, more context-aware, and less brittle across devices and processes. It's a solid roundup of platform work that should make shortcuts, Siri interactions, widgets, and app handoffs feel more natural for users, even if they never know the API names behind it. And that's usually the good kind of plumbing. You barely notice it when it works. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.